CHAPTER III of Langstroth on the Hive and the Honey Bee. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marcetich, August 2009, Alexandria, Virginia. Langstroth on the Hive and the Honey Bee by L. L. Langstroth. Chapter 3, Part 2. Continued from Part 1. The cocoon of the royal larva is very much stronger and coarser than that spun by the drone or worker, its texture considerably resembling that of the silkworms. The young queen does not come forth from her cell until she is quite mature, and as its great size gives her abundant room to exercise her wings, she is capable of flying as soon as she quits it. While still in her cell, she makes the fluttering and piping noises with which every observant bee keeper is so well acquainted. Some Apiarians have supposed that the queen bee has the power to regulate the development of eggs in her ovaries, so that few or many are produced, according to the necessities of the colony. This is evidently a mistake. Her eggs, like those of the domestic hen, are formed without any volition of her own, and when fully developed must be extruded. If the weather is unfavorable, or if the colony is too feeble to maintain a sufficient heat, a smaller number of eggs are developed in her ovaries, just as unfavorable circumstances diminish the number of eggs laid by the hen. If the weather is very cold, egg laying usually ceases altogether. In the latitude of Philadelphia, I opened one of my hives on the 5th day of February, and found an abundance of eggs and brood, although the winter had been an unusually cold one, and the temperature of the preceding month very low. The fall of 1852 was a warm one, and eggs and brood were found in a hive, which I examined on the 21st of October. Powerful stocks in well protected hives contain some brood, at least 10 months in the year. In warm countries, bees probably breed every month in the year. It is highly interesting to see in what way the supernumerary eggs of the queen are disposed of. When the number of workers is too small to take charge of all her eggs, or when there is a deficiency of bee bread to nourish the young, (see chapter on pollen), or when, for any reason, she judges it not best to deposit them in cells, she stands upon a comb, and simply extrudes them from her oviduct, and the workers devour them as fast as they are laid. This I have repeatedly witnessed in my observing hives, and admire the sagacity of the queen in economizing her necessary work after this fashion, instead of laboriously depositing the eggs in cells where they are not wanted. What a difference between her wise management and the stupidity of a hen obstinately persisting to set upon addled eggs, or pieces of chalk, and often upon nothing at all. The workers eat up also all the eggs which are dropped, or deposited out of place by the queen. In this way, nothing goes to waste, and even a tiny egg is turned to some account. Was there ever a better comment upon the maxim? Take care of the pence, and the pounds will take care of themselves. Do the workers who appear to be so fond of a tidbit in the shape of a new laid egg, ever experience a struggle between their appetites and the claims of duty, and does it cost them some self-denial to refrain from making a breakfast on a fresh laid egg? It is really very difficult for one who has carefully watched the habits of bees, to speak of his little favorites in any other way than as though they possessed an intelligence almost, if not quite, akin to reason. It is well known to every breeder of poultry, that the fertility of a hen decreases with age, until at length, she becomes entirely barren. It is equally certain that the fertility of the queen bee ordinarily diminishes after she has entered upon her third year. She sometimes ceases to lay worker eggs, a considerable time before she dies of old age. The contents of the spermatheca are exhausted, the eggs can no longer be impregnated, and must therefore produce drones. The queen bee usually dies of old age, some time in her fourth year, although instances are on record of some having survived a year longer. It is highly important to the bee keeper, who would receive the largest returns from his bees, to be able, as in my hives, to catch a queen, and remove her, when she has passed the period of her greatest fertility. In the sequel, full directions will be given, as to the proper time and mode of effecting it. Before proceeding farther in the natural history of the queen bee, I shall describe more particularly the other inmates of the hive. The drones or male bees. The drones are, unquestionably, the male bees. Dissection proves that they have the appropriate organs of generation. They are much larger and stouter than either the queen or workers, although their bodies are not quite so long as that of the queen. They have no sting with which to defend themselves, no proboscis which is suitable for gathering honey from the flowers, and no baskets on their thighs for holding the bee bread. They are thus physically disqualified for work, even if they were ever so well disposed to it. Their proper office is to impregnate the young queens, and they are usually destroyed by the bees, soon after this is completed. Dr. Evans, the author of a beautiful poem on bees, thus appropriately describes them: "Their short proboscis sips no luscious nectar from the wild thyme's lips; from the lime's leaf no amber drops they steal, nor bear their grooveless thighs the foodful meal. On other toils in pampered leisure thrive the lazy fathers of the industrious hive." The drones begin to make their appearance in April or May, earlier or later, according to climate and the forwardness of the season, and the strength of the stock. They require about 24 days for their full development from the egg. In colonies which are too weak to swarm, none, as a general rule, are reared. They are not needed, for in such hives, as no young queens are raised, they would be only useless consumers. The number of drones in a hive is often very great, amounting, not merely to hundreds, but sometimes to thousands. It seems, at first, very difficult to understand why there should be so many, especially since it has been ascertained that a single one will impregnate a queen for life. But as intercourse always takes place high in the air, the young queens are obliged to leave the hive for this purpose, and it is exceedingly important to their safety that they should be sure of finding one, without being compelled to make frequent excursions. Being larger than a worker, and less quick on the wing, they are more exposed to be caught by birds, or blown down and destroyed by sudden gusts of wind. In a large apiary, a few drones in each hive, or the number usually found in one, might be amply sufficient. But it must be borne in mind that under these circumstances, bees are not in a state of nature. Before they were domesticated, a colony living in a forest often had no neighbors for miles. Now a good stock in our climate sometimes sends out 3 or more swarms, and in the tropical climates, of which the bee is a native, they increase with astonishing rapidity. At Sydney, in Australia, a single colony is stated to have multiplied to 300 in 3 years. All the new swarms except the first, are led off by a young queen, and as she is never impregnated until after she has been established as the head of a separate family, it is important that they should all be accompanied by a goodly number of drones, and this renders it necessary that a large number should be produced in the parent hive. As this necessity no longer exists, when the bee is domesticated, the production of so many drones should be discouraged. Traps have been invented to destroy them, but it is much better to save the bees the labor and expense of rearing such a host of useless consumers. This can readily be done by the use of my hives. The cells in which the drones are reared, are much larger than those appropriated to the raising of workers. The combs containing them may be taken out, to have their places supplied with workers' cells, and thus the overproduction of drones may easily be prevented. Some colonies contain so much drone comb as to be nearly worthless. I have no doubt that some of my readers will object to this mode of management as interfering with nature, but let them remember that the bee is not in a state of nature, and that the same objection might be urged against killing off the supernumerary males of our domestic animals. In July or August, soon after the swarming season is over, the bees expel the drones from the hive. They sometimes sting them, and sometimes gnaw the roots of their wings, so that when driven from the hive, they cannot return. If not treated in either of these summary ways, they are so persecuted and starved, that they soon perish. The hatred of bees extends even to the young which are still unhatched. They are mercilessly pulled from the cells, and destroyed with the rest. How wonderful that instinct which teaches the bees that there is no longer any occasion for the service of the drones, and which impels them to destroy those members of the colony, which, a short time before, they reared with such devoted attention. A colony which neglects to expel its drones at the usual season, ought always to be examined. The queen is probably either diseased or dead. In my hives, such an examination may be easily made, the true state of the cause ascertained, and the proper remedies at once applied. See chapter on the loss of the queen. The production of so many drones necessary, in a state of nature, to prevent degeneracy from in and inbreeding. I have often been able, by the reasons previously assigned, to account for the necessity of such a large number of drones in a state of nature, to the satisfaction of others, but never fully to my own. I have repeatedly queried, why impregnation might not just as well have been effected in the hive, as on the wing, in the open air. Two very obvious and highly important advantages would have resulted from such an arrangement. First, a few dozen drones would have amply sufficed for the wants of any colony, even if, as in tropical climates, it swarmed half a dozen times or oftener, in the same season. Second, the young queens would have been exposed to none of those risks which they now incur, in leaving the hive for fecundation. I was unable to show how the existing arrangement is best, although I never doubted that there must be a satisfactory reason for this seeming imperfection. To suppose otherwise, would be highly unphilosophical, since we constantly see, as the circle of our knowledge is enlarged, many mysteries in nature hitherto inexplicable fully cleared up. Let me here ask if the disposition, which too many students of nature cherish, to reject some of the doctrines of revealed religion, is not equally unphilosophical. Neither our ignorance of all the facts necessary to their full elucidation, nor our ability to harmonize these facts in their mutual relations and dependencies, will justify us in rejecting any truth which God has seen fit to reveal, either in the book of nature, or in His holy word. The man who would substitute his own speculations for the divine teaching, has embarked, without rudder or chart, pilot or compass, upon the uncertain ocean of theory and conjecture. Unless he turns his prow from its fatal course, no sun of righteousness will ever brighten for him the dreary expanse of waters. Storms and whirlwinds will thicken in gloom on his voyage of life, and no favoring gales will ever waft his shattered bark to a peaceful haven. The thoughtful reader will require no apology for the moralizing strain of many of my remarks, nor blame a clergyman, in forgetting sometimes to speak as the mere naturalist. He endeavors to find tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in bees, and God in everything. To return to the point from which I have digressed, a new attempt to account for the existence of so many drones. If a farmer persists in what is called breeding in and in, that is, from the same stock without changing the blood, it is well known that a rapid degeneracy is the inevitable consequence. This law extends, as far as we know, to all animal life, and even man is not exempt from its influence. Have we any reason to suppose that the bee is an exception? Or that ultimate degeneracy would not ensue, unless some provision was made to counteract the tendency to in breeding? If fecundation had taken place in the hive, the queen bee must of necessity have been impregnated by drones from a common parent, and the same result must have taken place in each successive generation, until the whole species would have eventually run out. By the present arrangement, the young females, when they leave the hive, often find the air swarming with drones, many of which belong to other colonies, and thus by crossing the breed, a provision is constantly made to prevent deterioration. Experience has proved not only that it is unnecessary to impregnation that there should be drones in the colony of the young queen, but that this may be effected even when there are no drones in the apiary, and none except at some considerable distance. Intercourse takes place very high in the air, perhaps that less risk may be incurred from birds, and this is the more favorable to the continual crossing of stocks. I am strongly persuaded that the decay of many flourishing stocks, even when managed with great care, is to be attributed to the fact that they have become enfeebled by close breeding, and are thus unable to resist the injurious influences which were comparatively harmless when the bees were in a state of high physical vigor. I shall, in the chapter on artificial swarming, explain in what way, by the use of my hives, the stock of bees may be easily crossed, when a cultivator is too remote from other apiaries, to depend upon its being naturally effected. The workers or common bees. The number of workers in a hive varies very much. A good swarm ought to contain 15,000 or 20,000, and in large hives strong colonies which are not reduced by swarming, frequently number 2 or 3 times as many, during the height of the breeding season. We have well authenticated instances of stocks much more populous than this. The Polish hives will hold several bushels, and yet we are informed by Mr. Dohiogost, that they swarm regularly, and that the swarms are so powerful that they resemble a little cloud in the air. I shall hereafter consider how the size of the hive affects the number of bees that it may be expected to produce. The workers, as has been already stated, are all females whose ovaries are too imperfectly developed to admit of their laying eggs. For a long time, they were regarded as neither males nor females, and were called neuters, but more careful microscopic examinations have enabled us to detect the rudiments of their ovaries, and thus to determine their sex. The accuracy of these examinations has been verified by the well-known facts respecting fertile workers. Riem, a German apiarian, first discovered that workers sometimes lay eggs. Huber, in the course of his investigations on this subject, ascertained that such workers were raised in hives that had lost their queen, and in the vicinity of the royal cells in which young queens were being reared. He conjectured that they received accidentally a small portion of the peculiar food of these infant queens, and in this way, he accounted for their reproductive organs being more developed than those of other workers. Workers reared in such hives are in close proximity to the young queens, and there is certainly much probability that some of the royal jelly may be accidentally dropped into their cells, as, in these hives, the queen cells when first commenced are parallel to the horizon, instead of being perpendicular to it, as they are in other hives. I do not feel confident, however, that they are not sometimes bred in hives which have not lost their queen. The kind of eggs laid by these fertile workers has already been noticed. Such workers are seldom tolerated in hives containing a fertile, healthy queen, though instances of this kind have been known to occur. The worker is much smaller than either the queen or the drone. It is furnished with a tongue or proboscis, of the most curious and complicated structure, which, when not in use, is nicely folded under its abdomen. With this, it licks or brushes up the honey, which is thence conveyed to its honey bag. This receptacle is not larger than a very small pea, and is so perfectly transparent as to appear when filled, of the same color with its contents. It is properly the first stomach of the bee, and is surrounded by muscles which enable the bee to compress it, and empty its contents through her proboscis into the cells. See Chapter on Honey. The hinder legs of the worker are furnished with a spoon-shaped hollow or basket, to receive the pollen or bee bread, which she gathers from the flowers. See Chapter on Pollen. Every worker is armed with a formidable sting, and when provoked, makes instant and effectual use of her natural weapon. The sting, when subjected to microscopic examination, exhibits a very curious and complicated mechanism. "It is moved by muscles which, though invisible to the eye, are yet strong enough to force the sting, to the depth of 1/12 of an inch, through the thick skin of a man's hand. At its root are situated 2 glands by which the poison is secreted. These glands uniting in one duct, eject the venomous liquid along the groove, formed by the junction of the two piercers. There are 4 barbs on the outside of each piercer. When the insect is prepared to sting, one of these piercers, having its point a little longer than the other, first darts into the flesh, and being fixed by its foremost beard, the other strikes in also, and they alternately penetrate deeper and deeper, till they acquire a firm hold of the flesh with their barbed hooks, and then follows the sheath, conveying the poison into the wound. The action of the sting, says Paley, affords an example of the union of chemistry and mechanism; of chemistry in respect to the venom, which can produce such powerful effects; of mechanism, as the sting is a compound instrument. The machinery would have been comparatively useless, had it not been for the chemical process, by which the insect's body honey is converted into poison; and on the other hand, the poison would have been ineffectual, without an instrument to wound, and a syringe to inject it. Upon examining the edge of a very keen razor by the microscope, it appears as broad as the back of a pretty thick knife, rough, uneven, and full of notches and furrows, and so far from anything like sharpness, that an instrument, as blunt as this seemed to be, would not serve even to cleave wood. An exceedingly small needle being also examined, it resembled a rough iron bar out of a smith's forge. The sting of a bee, viewed through the same instrument, showed everywhere a polish amazingly beautiful, without the least flaw, blemish, or inequality, and ended in a point too fine to be discerned." The extremity of the sting being barbed like an arrow, the bee can seldom withdraw it, if the substance into which she darts it is at all tenacious. In losing her sting, she parts with a portion of her intestines, and, of necessity, soon perishes. As the loss of the sting is always fatal to the bees, they pay a dear penalty for the exercise of their patriotic instincts; but they always seem ready, except when they have taken a drop too much, and are gorged with honey, to die in defense of their home and treasures; or as the poet has expressed it, they "Deem life itself to vengeance well resigned, Die on the wound, and leave their sting behind." Hornets, wasps, and other stinging insects are able to withdraw their stings from the wound. I have never seen any attempt to account for the exception in the case of the honey bee. But if the Creator intended the bee for the use of man, as He most certainly did, has He not given it this peculiarity, to make it less formidable, and therefore more completely subject to human control? Without a sting, it would have stood no chance of defending its tempting sweets against a host of greedy depredators; but if it could sting a number of times, it would be much more difficult to bring it into a state of thorough domestication. A quiver full of arrows in the hand of a skillful marksman is far more to be dreaded than a single shaft. The defense of the colony against enemies, the construction of the cells, the storing of them with honey and bee bread, the rearing of the young, in short, the whole work of the hive, the laying of eggs excepted, is carried on by the industrious little workers. There may be gentlemen of leisure in the commonwealth of bees, but most assuredly there are no such ladies, whether of high or low degree. The queen herself has her full share of duties, for it must be admitted that the royal office is no sinecure. when the mother who fills it, must superintend daily the proper disposition of several thousand eggs. Age of bees. The queen bee, as has been already stated, will live 4, and sometimes, though very rarely, 5 years. As the life of the drones is usually cut short by violence, it is not easy to ascertain its precise limit. Bevan, in some interesting statements on the longevity of bees, estimates it not to exceed 4 months. The workers are supposed by him to live 6 or 7 months. Their age depends, however, very much upon their greater or less exposure to injurious influences and severe labors. Those reared in the spring and early part of summer, and on whom the heaviest labors of the hive must necessarily devolve, do not appear to live more than 2 or 3 months, while those which are bred at the close of summer, and early in autumn, being able to spend a large part of their time in repose, attain a much greater age. It is very evident that the bee, to use the words of a quaint old writer, is a summer bird, and that with the exception of the queen, none live to be a year old. Notched and ragged wings, instead of gray hairs and wrinkled faces, are the signs of old age in the bee, and indicate that its season of toil will soon be over. They appear to die rather suddenly, and often spend their last days, and sometimes even their last hours, in useful labors. Place yourself before a hive, and see the indefatigable energy of these aged veterans, toiling along with their heavy burdens, side by side with their more youthful compeers, and then say if you can, that you have done work enough, and that you will give yourself up to slothful indulgence, while the ability for useful labor still remains. Let the cheerful hum of their industrious old age inspire you with better resolutions, and teach you how much nobler it is to meet death in the path of duty, striving still, as you have opportunity, to do good unto all men. The age which individual members of the community may attain, must not be confounded with that of the colony. Bees have been known to occupy the same domicile for a great number of years. I have seen flourishing colonies which were 20 years old, and the Abbé della Rocca speaks of some over 40 years old. Such cases have led to the erroneous opinion that bees are a long-lived race. But this, as Dr. Evans has observed, is just as wise as if a stranger, contemplating a populous city, and personally unacquainted with its inhabitants, should on paying it a second visit, many years afterwards, and finding it equally populous, imagine that it was peopled by the same individuals, not one of whom might then be living. "Like leaves on trees, the race of bees is found, now green in youth, now withering on the ground. Another race the spring or fall supplies, they droop successive, and successive rise." The cocoons spun by the larvae are never removed by the bees. They stick so closely to the sides of the cells, that the knowing bee well understands that the labor of removal would cost more than it would be worth. In the process of time, the breeding cells become too small for the proper development of the young. In some cases, the bees must take down and reconstruct the old combs, for if they did not, the young issuing from them would always be dwarfs, whereas I once compared with other bees, those of a colony more than 15 years old, and found no perceptible difference. That they do not always renew the old combs, must be admitted, as the young from some old hives are often considerably below the average size. On this account, it is very desirable to be able to remove the old combs occasionally, that their place may be supplied with new ones. It is a great mistake to imagine that the brood combs ought to be changed every year. In my hives, they might, if it were desirable, be easily changed several times in a year. But once in 5 or 6 years is often enough. Oftener than this requires a needless consumption of honey to replace them, besides being for other reasons undesirable, as the bees are always in winter colder in new comb than in old. Inventors of hives have too often been most emphatically men of one idea, and that one, instead of being a well-established and important fact in the physiology of the bee, has frequently, like the necessity for a yearly change of the brood combs, been merely a conceit, existing nowhere but in the brain of a visionary projector. This is all harmless enough, until an effort is made to impose such miserable crudities upon an ignorant public, either in the shape of a patented hive, or worse still, of an unpatented hive, the pretended right to use which is fraudulently sold to the cheated purchaser. For want of proper knowledge with regard to the age of bees, huge bee palaces, and large closets in garrets or attics, have been constructed, and their proprietors have vainly imagined that the bees would fill them, however roomy, for they can see no reason why a colony should not continue to increase indefinitely, until at length it numbers its inhabitants by millions or billions. As the bees can never at one time equal, still less exceed the number which the queen is capable of producing in one season, these spacious dwellings have always an abundance of spare rooms. It seems strange that men can be thus deceived, when often in their own apiary, they have healthy stocks which have not swarmed for a year or more, and which yet in the spring are not a whit more populous than those which have regularly parted with vigorous swarms. It is certain that the Creator has for some wise reason set a limit to the increase of numbers in a single colony, and I shall venture to assign what appears to me to have been one reason for his so doing. Suppose that he had given to the bee a length of life as great as that of the horse, or the cow, or had made each queen capable of laying daily some hundreds of thousands of eggs, or had given several hundred queens to each hive, then from the very nature of the case, a colony must have gone on increasing, until it became a scourge rather than a benefit to man. In the warm climates of which the bee is a native, they would have established themselves in some cavern or capacious cleft in the rocks, and would there have quickly become so powerful as to bid defiance to all attempts to appropriate the avails of their labors. It has already been stated, that none, except the mother wasps and hornets, survive the winter. If these insects had been able, like the bee, to commence the season with the accumulated strength of a large colony, long before its close, they would have proved a most intolerable nuisance. If, on the contrary, the queen bee had been compelled, solitary and alone, to lay the foundations of a new commonwealth, the honey harvest would have disappeared before she could have become the parent of a numerous family. In the laws which regulate the increase of bees, as well as in other parts of their economy, we have the plainest proofs that the insect was formed for the special service of the human race. The process of rearing the queen more particularly described. If in the early part of the season, the population of a hive becomes uncomfortably crowded, the bees usually make preparations for swarming. a number of royal cells are commenced, and they are placed almost always upon those edges of the combs which are not attached to the sides of the hive. These cells somewhat resemble a small ground nut or pea nut, and are about an inch deep, and 1/3 of an inch in diameter. They are very thick, and require a large quantity of material for their construction. They are seldom seen in a perfect state, as the bees nibble them away after the queen has hatched, leaving only their remains, in the shape of a very small acorn cup. While the other cells open sideways, these always hang with their mouth downwards. Much speculation has arisen as to the reason for this deviation. Some have conjectured that their peculiar position exerted an influence upon the development of the royal larvae, while others, having ascertained that no injurious effect was produced by turning them upwards, or placing them in any other position, have considered this deviation as among the inscrutable mysteries of the bee hive. So it always seemed to me, until more careful reflection enabled me to solve the problem. The queen cells open downwards, simply to save room! The distance between the parallel ranges of comb being usually less than half an inch, the bees could not have made the royal cells to open sideways, without sacrificing the cells opposite to them. In order to economize space, to the very utmost, they put them upon the unoccupied edges of the comb, as the only place where there is always plenty of room for such very large cells. The number of royal cells varies greatly. Sometimes there are only 2 or 3. Ordinarily there are 5 or 6, and I have occasionally seen more than a dozen. They are not all commenced at once, for the bees do not intend that the young queens shall all arrive at maturity at the same time. I do not consider it as fully settled, how the eggs are deposited in these cells. In some few instances, I have known the bees to transfer the eggs from common to queen cells, and this may be their general method of procedure. I shall hazard the conjecture that the queen deposits her eggs in cells on the edges of the comb, in a crowded state of the hive, and that some of these are afterwards enlarged and changed into royal cells by the workers. Such is the instinctive hatred of the queen to her own kind, that it does not seem to me probable that she is entrusted with even the initiatory steps for securing a race of successors. That the eggs from which the young queens are produced, are of the same kind with those producing workers, has been repeatedly demonstrated. On examining the queen cells while they are in progress, one of the first things which excites our notice, is the very unusual amount of attention bestowed upon them by the workers. There is scarcely a second in which a bee is not peeping into them, and just as fast as one is satisfied, another pops its head in, to examine if not to report progress. The importance of their inmates to the bee community might easily be inferred from their being the center of so much attraction. Royal Jelly. The young queens are supplied with a much larger quantity of food than is allotted to the other larvae, so that they seem almost to float in a thick bed of jelly, and there is usually a portion of it left unconsumed at the base of the cells, after the insects have arrived at maturity. It is different from the food of either drones or workers, and in appearance, resembles a light quince jelly, having a slightly acid taste. I submitted a portion of the royal jellies for analysis, to Dr. Charles M. Wetherill, of Philadelphia. A very interesting account of his examination may be found in the proceedings of the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences, for July 1852. He speaks of the substance as "truly a bread-containing albuminous compound." I hope in the course of the coming summer to obtain from this able analytical chemist an analysis of the food of the young drones and workers. A comparison of its elements with those of the royal jelly may throw some light on subjects as yet involved in obscurity. The effects produced upon the larvae by this peculiar food and method of treatment are very remarkable. For one, I have never considered it strange that such effects should be rejected as idle whims, by nearly all except those who have either been eye-witnesses to them, or have been well acquainted with the character and opportunities for accurate observation, of those on whose testimony they have received them. They are not only in themselves most marvelously strange, but on the face of them, so entirely opposed to all common analogies, and so very improbable, that many men when asked to believe them, feel almost as though an insult were offered to their common sense. The most important of these effects I shall now proceed to enumerate. First, the peculiar mode in which the worm designed to be reared as a queen, is treated, causes it to arrive at maturity about 1/3 earlier than if it had been bred a worker, and yet it is to be much more fully developed, and according to ordinary analogy, ought to have had a slower growth. Second, its organs of reproduction are completely developed so that it is capable of fulfilling the office of a mother. Third, its size, shape, and color are all greatly changed. See page 32. Its lower jaws are shorter, its head rounder, and its legs have neither brushes nor baskets, while its sting is more curved, and 1/3 longer than that of a worker. Fourth, its instincts are entirely changed. Reared as a worker, it would have been ready to thrust out its sting upon the least provocation, whereas now, it may be pulled limb from limb without attempting to sting. As a worker, it would have treated a queen with the greatest consideration, whereas now, if placed under a glass with another queen, it rushes forthwith to mortal combat with its rival. As a worker, it would frequently have left the hive, either for labor or exercise. As a queen, after impregnation, it never leaves the hive, except to accompany a new swarm. Fifth, the term of its life is remarkably lengthened. As a worker, it would have lived not more than 6 or 7 months at farthest. As a queen, it may live 7 or 8 times as long. All these wonders rest on the impregnable basis of complete demonstration, and instead of being witnessed by only a select few, may now, by the use of my hive, be familiar sights to any bee keeper, who prefers to acquaint himself with facts, rather than to cavil and sneer at the labors of others. When provision has been made, in the manner described, for a new race of queens, the old mother always departs with the first swarm, before her successors have arrived at maturity. Artificial rearing of queens. The distress of the bees when they lose their queen, has already been described. If they have the means of supplying her loss, they soon calm down, and commence forthwith the necessary steps for rearing another. The process of rearing queens artificially, to meet some special emergency, is even more wonderful than the natural one, which has already been described. Its success depends on the bees having worker eggs or worms not more than 3 days old. If older, the larva has been too far developed as a worker to admit of any change. The bees nibble away the partitions of 2 cells adjoining a third, so as to make one large cell out of the 3. They destroy the eggs or worms in 2 of these cells, while they place before the occupant of the third, the usual food of the young queens, and build out its cell, so as to give it ample space for development. They do not confine themselves to the attempt to rear a single queen, but to guard against failure, start a considerable number, although the work on all except a few is usually soon discontinued. In 12 or 14 days, they are in possession of a new queen, precisely similar to one reared in the natural way, while the eggs which were laid at the same time in the adjoining cells, and which have been developed in the usual way, are nearly a week longer in coming to maturity. I will give in this connection a description of an interesting experiment. A large hive which stood at a distance from any other colony, was removed in the morning of a very pleasant day to a new place, and another hive containing only empty comb was put upon its stand. Thousands of workers which were out in the fields, or which left the old hive after its removal, returned to the familiar spot. It was affecting to witness their grief and despair. They flew in restless circles about the place which once contained their happy home, entered and left the new hive continually, expressing, in various ways, their lamentations over their cruel bereavement. Towards evening, they ceased to take wing, and roamed in restless platoons, and in and out of the hive, and over its surface, acting all the time, as though in search of some lost treasure. I now gave them a piece of brood comb, containing worker eggs and worms, taken from a second swarm, which being just established with its young queen, in a new hive, could have no intention of rearing young queens that season. Therefore, it cannot be contended that this piece of comb contained what some are pleased to call royal eggs. What followed the introduction of this brood comb, took place much quicker than it can be described. The bees which first touched it, raised a peculiar note, and in a moment, the comb was covered with a dense mass. Their restless motions and mournful noises ceased, and a cheerful hum at once attested to their delight. Despair gave place to hope, as they recognized in this small piece of comb, the means of deliverance. Suppose a large building filled with thousands of persons, tearing their hair, beating their breasts, and by piteous cries, as well as frantic gestures, giving vent to their despair. If now someone should enter this house of mourning, and by a single word, cause all these demonstrations of agony to give place to smiles and congratulations, the change could not have been more wonderful and instantaneous, than that produced when the bees received the brood comb. The Orientals called the honey bee, Deborah, "she that speaketh." Would that this little insect might speak, and in words more eloquent than those of man's device, to the multitudes who allow themselves to reject the doctrines of revealed religion, because, as they assert, they are, on their face so utterly improbable, that they labor under an a priori objection strong enough to be fatal to their credibility. Do not nearly all the steps in the development of a queen from a worker egg labor under precisely the same objection? And have they not, for this very reason, always been regarded by a great number of bee keepers, as unworthy of credence? If the favorite argument of infidels and errorists will not stand the test when applied to the wonders of the beehive, can it be regarded as entitled to any serious weight when employed in framing objections against religious truths, and arrogantly taking to task the infinite Jehovah for what he has been pleased to do or to teach? Give me the same latitude claimed by such objectors, and I can easily prove that a man is under no obligation to receive any of the wonders in the economy of the beehive, although he is himself an intelligent eyewitness that they are all substantial verities. I shall quote, in this connection, from Huish, an English Apiarian of whom I have already spoken, because his objections to the discoveries of Huber remind me so forcibly of both the spirit and principles of the great majority of those who object to the doctrines of revealed religion. Quote, "If an individual, with the view of acquiring some knowledge of the natural history of the bee, or of its management, consults the works of Bagster, Bevan, or any of the periodicals which casually treat upon the subject, will he not rise from the study of them with his mind surcharged with falsities and mystification? Will he not discover through the whole of them a servile acquiescence in the opinions and discoveries of one man, however at variance they may be with truth or probability, and if he enter upon the discussion with his mind free from prejudice, will he not experience that an outrage has been committed upon his reason, in calling upon him to give assent to positions and principles, which at best are merely assumed, but to which he is called upon dogmatically to subscribe his acquiescence as the indubitable results of experience, skill, and ability? The editors of the works above alluded to, should boldly and indignantly have declared, that from their own experience in the natural economy of the insect, they were able to pronounce the circumstances as related by Huber, to be directly impossible, and the whole of them based on fiction and imposition." Let the reader change only a few words in this extract for "the natural history of the bee or its management," let him write "the subject of religion," for "the works of Bagster, Bevan," let him put "the works of Moses, Paul," etc., for "their own experience in the natural economy of the insect," let him substitute "their own experience in the nature of man," and for "circumstances as related by Huber," let him insert "as related by Luker John," and it will sound almost precisely like a passage from some infidel author. I resume the quotation from Huish. "If we examine the account which Huber gives of his invention, of the royal jelly, the existence and efficiency of which are fully acquiesced in by the aforesaid editors, to what other conclusions are we necessarily driven, than that they are the dupes of a visionary enthusiast, whose greatest merit consists in his inventive powers, no matter how destitute those powers may be of all affinity with truth or probability?" Before, however, these editors bestowed their unqualified assent on the existence of this royal jelly, did they stop to put themselves to the following questions? By what kind of bee is it made? Whence is it procured? Is it a natural or elaborated substance? If natural, from what source is it derived? If elaborated, in what stomach of the bee is it to be found? How is it administered? What are its constituent principles? Is its existence optional or definite? Whence does it derive its miraculous power of converting a common egg into a royal one? Will any of the aforesaid editors publicly answer these questions, and ought they not to have been able to answer them, before they so unequivocally expressed their belief in its existence, its powers and administration?" How puerile does all this sound to one who has seen and tasted the royal jelly? And permit me to add, how equally unmeaning do the objections of infidels seem, to those who have an experimental acquaintance with the divine hopes and consolations of the Gospel of Christ. CHAPTER 4.